Hey, welcome. To get started in this project, I took my protractor and used this ruler that's got little dimples to set the size of the circle. As you can see here, I messed about a few times getting it wrong, and then eventually I did it the smart way. My goal was to use as much scrap wood as possible for the bits of this project that you're not going to see. So I had 6 of these boards from a project that got cancelled, and so I got a half circle here, and then I used one that I'd already cut to try and work out and just get as much as I could out of it, and I managed to get a full circle out of each board, so I ended up using 3 boards like this. I wanted to use a lot of scrap wood, and I did use a lot of scrap wood lying around, and maybe it was a waste of time, I don't know. Also, it ended up that the inside of this table was a bit ugly, which you'll see in a bit, but I was making it for our own shop, and so I didn't really mind too much what the inside looks like, and also the inside's never seen unless you turn the table upside down, and so I thought it'd be an interesting way to try and use up scraps, and these 6 boards in particular, I've got no idea what else I would do with them. I cleaned up the cut edges on the belt sander and tried to make them as round as possible. The 3 circles that I ended up with weren't all perfectly round, and so there was a little issue that I dealt with later. I drew a circle on the bench and used that as a template for turning these pieces into circles. I then glued and nailed the sections together to form rigid circles. This nail gun's seen some better days, and it was struggling to get some of the nails through the birch ply, so I pulled them out where I could. To join the 3 circles together and create a cylinder, I originally cut those 6 bits of plywood that you can see there, and then I decided that I had these old 2x4 noggins lying around, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll use them instead because they're a bit chunkier and it'll make the whole thing a bit stronger. I took them over to the miter saw, cut a clean end, and then cut them all to length. I then marked out the positions of where I'd like them to go. They're roughly in fifths, but not exactly. As you can see there, because some of the plywood is double layered, I have to kind of account for that and work around that to some degree. So I marked where I wanted them all to go, and then I pre-drilled them and screwed them all together. At first I did it like this because I was a little bit worried about getting the posts in line with the edge, but it ended up being fine. I then found the best way of doing it was hammering the screws in a little bit so the post underneath didn't move as I screwed the screw in, because it wanted to twist when I put the first screw in. On the ones like this where it's going underneath a double layer, all these legs are the same length, so in the ones where it's going underneath a double layer, I just make sure when I then put the next layer on that it goes through into the recess, into the gap between the lower layer, like this. So I screwed the 3 layers together with the legs just slightly offset from each other so that I could get in with the screws, and it felt like a pretty robust structure. I was glad I used the 2x4s, but it definitely felt solid enough for what I needed it to do. So this is what it looks like when it's done, and the next thing we did was wrap it in bendy plywood. Bendy plywood wasn't quite long enough, so we had a little gap that we had to fill in, so we cut these little thin strips, and you can see there they slotted in. So the circumference of the circle was about 250 centimeters. I maybe could have designed that better and done it at exactly 240 so that it fitted a full sheet of ply, but next time. I wanted to reinforce the joins, so I cut another few bits of bendy plywood, glued them, and then stuck them on the inside of the drum, and then put a shed load of screws in from the outside, because each screw kind of helped to bring the whole thing round. I think with hindsight using bendy MDF might have been better, because the problem with the plywood is where the two ends meet, it creates a bit of a corner rather than being a smooth continuous curve. And so I put a lot of screws kind of down that joint to try and make sure that it was as rounded as possible. In the end, for this project, it was totally fine, but if I was doing it again, probably MDF would work better. Once we'd put all those screws in, cut off the excess bit at the top, we filled in some of the gaps. And so this is what I was meaning by the three circles not being exactly the same. You know, there was a gap here or there, and the plywood is pretty good at keeping the whole thing round. You know, like it won't just bend along its length up and down the cylinder. And so wherever there was a little gap like this, we put in a couple of wedges and nailed them in, sawed them off. We then nailed the plywood onto the structure all the way around, top and bottom, possibly in the middle as well, I can't actually remember, just to make sure it was well secured to it. The next thing I did was drilled and tapped the holes for the leveling feet. I put 5 leveling feet on the bottom, and I think the tap only really worked in the plywood. I did it where the noggins, the 2x4s were as well, but you know, into end grain like that, I just don't think the tap was strong enough. But in 18mm birch ply, I think it's totally fine. And the feet went in quite nicely and felt secure once they were in there. I took out all the screws again for 2 reasons. One, to reuse them because there's a lot of screws, but also because when we glue the half round dowels on, it'll be easier to glue it onto a smooth wooden surface. You can see there's a bit of a corner left at the joins there, so I just tried to sand the harsher edge off that. Here you can see the cylinder when it's done. We drew a square line down it before starting to cut and glue the half round dowels onto it. We cut the dowels in bunches because it's much faster, and then gave them a sand and started preparing them. I think we needed 115 or 125, something like that. We used contact adhesive to stick the half round dowels on, and it's a pretty messy job and it's quite slow. My dad was helping me out in this project, and he spent a good 2 or 3 days doing it. We glued a board to the top end of the cylinder to try and get all the dowels aligned nicely flush at that end. The dowels are cut, you can just see it there, slightly longer than the cylinder, so that they'll try and cover up the feet a little bit, so that when you're looking at the table you shouldn't really see the feet, you should just see the dowels like maybe 2-3 mil off the floor, something like that. With the cylinder coated in contact adhesive, the dowels with contact adhesive, they go on really easily. You just put them on and push them hard. And these dowels really don't take any strain. They're purely decorative. So as long as they're stuck hard enough to stay where they are, it's absolutely fine. One thing we also found is that if we needed to adjust them slightly, in the 5 or 10 minutes once they were stuck on, we could pull them off again and re-stick them quite nicely. So it worked really well. It was almost like Velcro. When it got to the space for the last 10 dowels, we measured them out to fit them, and we shaved a little bit off those 10 dowels. We made them about 1 mil smaller each, so that the last 10 dowels would end up fitting absolutely perfectly, and we wouldn't have like a half dowel or something like that. Some of the dowels and some of the little wedges managed to stick up a little bit, so I just took the plane over them to smooth it all out and make sure it had a perfectly flat contact with the top when it gets attached. 1 or 2 of the dowels got put on slightly squint and overlapping the next one, but it's a very forgiving finish. Next up, I started making the top. The spec for the top was to be 30mm thick, so I was joining an 18mm and a 12mm bit of ply. One of the things I was quite conscious of is not making the top too heavy, because I wanted it to be well balanced. So I had an idea that instead of making the 18mm on the underside of the top being a full sheet, I would make this kind of structure out of, again, scrap pieces that I had lying around, and that because there would be gaps and holes and spaces in it, that it would end up being lighter than a solid top. I was struggling to figure out how to close the gaps properly, so I had a bit of a think and had an idea of cutting in little beaks so that I could put clamps on, and with the clamps I was able to tighten each of the joints individually, which would also come in handy for glue up. After doing that, with 5 joints clamped, I still had a gap on the outside, so I thought, okay, probably what I've done is the angles were slightly off. It wasn't exact when I cut them on the miter saw, and so I took a ruler, lined it up with one side to cut this one parallel to the other one. So I got the blade set up on the line and then moved a piece of wood over it and just took the slightest trim off to hopefully make it line up with the other piece. But when I got there and I tightened the clamp, it was pretty unwilling to go in, and I realized fairly quickly that if the clamp wasn't on it, that it just sprung back open again. So I had another little think, then I figured out, let's add a little piece in. So I cut a piece to match and clamped it together, and it went together quite easily, and it seemed to be looking quite flush, and so I thought, okay, that's a good solution. So next up, I glued the whole thing together and clamped each joint to make it tight. I did the joints one by one rather than in 2 halves, so when it got to the end I couldn't put the dominoes on, but I just drilled a pocket hole, and that worked alright. This whole thing is going to be laminated to a 12mm sheet on top of it, so it doesn't really matter how well it's all stuck together. I then cut up some more scrap into strips, and I made a kind of ladder section to fit on the inside of the hexagon. To cut the hexagon into a circle, I drilled a 5mm hole in the centre for my circle cutting jig for my router. I used a tape measure and just held my pencil at slightly over where I wanted it to go. And this worked alright actually. The tape did slip off every now and again, but it worked quite well. And then the first thing I did was rough cut around that line with the jigsaw. Because I hadn't glued the outside pieces, they came off in sections, so I just kind of did section at a time, and it worked alright. I then got the router out and set it. I actually did it slightly over the desired radius. I was going for 160 centimeters, 1.6 meter diameter, and I think I did this at about 81 just in case I made a mistake and I would need to go back and trim it tighter. The bit that I'm using is a compression bit from Banggood, and it's pretty good. So at the bottom of the bit there it's got an upcut stroke, and at the top it's got a downcut stroke, so it leaves quite a nice finish. And this is what it looked like once it was routed. The 12mm sheet to go in the top, I had maybe 3 or 4 different sheets, and some of them just really didn't look good, or they had lots of voids, or they were different colours like this. So my dad had an idea to cut the 2 half circles from one sheet like this. So I drew that out on the sheet using this as a ruler, and then again tried to use the tape measure trick with a nail, but the tape kept slipping off, and so I ended up using a ruler, which was a bit easier. I next did the cut in between the 2 semicircles, but I forgot to film it. So here I thought, oh, here's a great idea. I'll just like pick up the track saw and not actually switch it on and make it look like I've done the cut. So there you go. There's acting for you. Next up, I took the jigsaw again and cut a slightly oversized curve to make them into semicircles, and then put a clean edge along the straight side, because these 2 straight sides are going to get butted together, so I wanted a nice sharp clean edge along both of them. I gave the base a bit of a sand just to make sure it was going to be a flat surface to receive the 12mm top, and then I put loads of glue, spread loads of glue all over it, and got ready to put half of the top on. To try and get it to adhere well in the middle where I couldn't clamp it, I nailed it together. I also probably could have put some heavy weights on it, but I didn't have that many heavy weights, and I think the nails worked okay. Around the edges I could put loads of clamps, and so I fitted pretty much all the clamps I had around the edge. I gave it one last trim with the jigsaw just so that there was less to take off on the final pass with the router. And then gave it a final sand all over to make sure no sharp edges and get the edge nice and smooth. I think the seam between the two pieces turned out okay. Obviously the grain didn't match perfectly, but it was still pretty good. And then last thing was to attach the base to the top. So we did this upside down so that we could get inside it and screw them together. After we screwed it together, we finished the whole thing with Osmo hard wax oil. So this is the first time I'd seen the whole thing together as one, and it was my first opportunity to test whether it tipped or not if you sit on the edge, and unfortunately it does. I could weight the base, we could put some sandbags or something inside the base if we wanted to be less tippy, but you can see how it's being used. It's a display table, and so I don't think anybody's going to sit on the edge of it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. This is definitely the most challenging video I've ever made in terms of it's the longest of the most clips, most comprehensive. So yeah, if you've enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. Thank you.